The day I stopped being my daughter's safety net, the message arrived at 6:12 on a rainy Tuesday morning, and although it contained only 8 words, "Mom, don't check the account until Friday," something in that strangely confident sentence made 70-year-old Margaret Collins put down her coffee and stare at her phone as if it had just warned her of an approaching storm. She had spent 42 years building a modest investment portfolio, paying off the little house overlooking Lake Briar, and quietly preparing for the retirement she had promised herself after her husband Robert died. But now her daughter Lauren's unexplained warning awakened a suspicion that had been growing for months, especially after Lauren and her fiancé Ethan began asking questions about Margaret's savings, property documents, the beneficiary information on her accounts. Rather than confront her daughter immediately, Margaret drove to the small credit union where she had banked since before Lauren was born, and the branch director, Patricia Reynolds, took one look at her expression before quietly closing the office door and asking what had happened. Margaret handed over her identification and requested a complete review of every transaction, and within minutes, Patricia discovered something far more disturbing than a single unauthorized withdrawal. Lauren had recently used an old authorization Margaret had forgotten to revoke to move $48,000 into an online investment account, while another $72,000 transfer had been scheduled for Friday morning under the description "family property settlement," despite Margaret having signed no such agreement. Patricia advised Margaret not to make any sudden accusation until every detail was documented, so Margaret authorized the bank to freeze the questionable transfers, remove the outdated permissions, and place enhanced verification requirements on her accounts. Then she called a real estate attorney she trusted and learned that Lauren and Ethan had been preparing to purchase a lakeside vacation property using Margaret's money as their supposed down payment. The discovery hurt more than Margaret expected because Lauren was not some distant relative making a selfish mistake. She was the child Margaret had raised alone after Robert's death, the little girl whose college tuition Margaret had funded by working weekends, the young woman who had once promised that she would never let her mother face old age alone, and now that promise seemed to have been replaced by a calculation about how much Margaret was worth. That afternoon, Margaret returned home and noticed another detail that suddenly made several strange incidents make sense. A folder containing her property deed, insurance papers, and tax records was missing from the locked cabinet in her study, and when she called Lauren to ask about it, her daughter answered too quickly and insisted that she had only borrowed the documents because Ethan's mortgage advisor needed to verify some family information. Margaret said nothing about the bank, but she calmly told Lauren that she and Ethan would need to move out of the guest cottage on Margaret's property by the end of the week because what had once been a temporary arrangement had quietly become a permanent occupation in which they contributed almost nothing while expecting Margaret to solve every financial problem they created. Lauren arrived that evening furious, followed by Ethan, who immediately began talking about betrayal, family obligations, and how cruel it was to threaten them with nowhere to live, but Margaret refused to argue and instead placed a thick envelope on the kitchen table containing copies of the bank records, the revoked authorization, the property documents they had attempted to use, and a written notice ending their permission to stay. Lauren's anger disappeared when she realized her mother knew everything, and after a long silence, she finally admitted that she and Ethan had convinced themselves Margaret would never spend all her money anyway, claiming they were only borrowing it to secure their future. But Margaret looked at the daughter she had sacrificed so much for and quietly replied that stealing from someone while calling it family planning did not make the theft loving. Ethan tried one final tactic, warning Margaret that removing them from the property could become complicated and suggesting that Lauren had rights because she was her daughter, but Margaret had already spoken with her attorney, changed the property access codes, documented the condition of the cottage, and arranged for a professional to oversee the removal of their belongings, leaving no room for intimidation or emotional bargaining. When Lauren began crying and begged her mother to forget everything, Margaret finally told her that forgiveness might come someday, but trust was not something a daughter could demand after deliberately treating her mother's security as an inheritance available before death. And she watched from the porch as their rented moving truck disappeared down the wet road without chasing after them or second-guessing herself. 3 months later, Margaret sat beside the lake with a blanket over her knees, listening to the wind move through the cedar trees while a new attorney-reviewed estate plan rested safely inside her desk. And although Lauren had not contacted her for several weeks, Margaret no longer felt consumed by anger because she had finally understood that protecting herself did not mean she had stopped loving her daughter. She had begun volunteering at a community garden, joined a photography group, and started planning the train journey through Canada she had postponed for 20 years, proving to herself that family should be built on affection, honesty, and mutual respect rather than guilt, and that sometimes the bravest form of love is refusing to finance the behavior that is destroying the relationship. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends. Tell me where from you watching my video.